Well, good morning, Cornerstone. Today we'll be in our last chapter of the book of Daniel, chapter 12. And before we start, I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about the struggle I've had this week in preparing for this. Because what I've really been wanting to try to do with this particular message is to wrestle with and deal with the challenge of the purpose of this second half of the book of Daniel, specifically Daniel 7 through 12. It's apocalyptic, it's prophetic, it's weird, and one kind of has to come to the point where they start asking the question, why is this even in here? And on a personal note, my typical sermon preparation, I really try to script out everything that I present on a Sunday. I try to write it out longhand. I type it all up. I usually have about 5 pages of notes, 4 to 5. And I have that this week, but every time I tried to formulate or hone this down into a really intentional, well-thought, scholarly approach, I wrestled with it, because the truth is, when it comes to this topic, to these 5 chapters of the Bible, I want to invite your criticism of my interpretation, because the truth is, I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of good people who argue and disagree over these topics, and I'm trying to draw away from this principles that will be helpful to our entire body and not just camp on one ideology or one interpretation and become dogmatic about it. Not because the Bible isn't true, and not because there isn't an appropriate interpretation, but because this stuff was confusing to Daniel. Daniel says at the end of chapter 7, the first chapter in the first vision that he has, that he says, verse 28, "And here's the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed. I kept the matter in my heart." And I have felt that since this week. And what I don't want people to do is, I don't want people to listen to or approach this message and go and then send me a text afterwards and say, "Great job, John. That was totally what we needed." Actually, I want you to go away from this week with a sense of reflection and a desire to search the scriptures more, because I don't need to be encouraged after this message. What I really hope is that you wrestle, like I have wrestled this week, with this question: what is the purpose of Daniel 7 through 12? What is the purpose of prophetic apocalyptic literature in the Bible? And how should I use that in my life as I approach my everyday Christianity? And so today's sermon is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to read and just kind of comment on Daniel 12 and just give you some background, just some tips on how to read it and how people have historically read it. And then I'm going to draw some conclusions about that question, about what is the purpose of apocalyptic writing in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. What's its purpose in Scripture? So let's go ahead and get into the Word, and then we'll look at it as we go. So Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. Read along with me if you're at home. Obviously you're at home. Duh, sorry. Read along with me at home. "At this time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble as has never been seen since the nation till that time." I'm going to stop already. Michael, the archangel Michael. Did you know he's only brought up in the Bible 3 times, and all 3 of those times are in the book of Daniel? Like, we make a big deal about angels. Gabriel is also brought up in the book of Daniel. We see him twice. He only shows up 2 more times in the entire Bible, both in Luke, in the account about Jesus' birth. Daniel's a weird book. Daniel is introducing ideas and concepts that we don't see in any other part of Scripture with this angel, Michael. And specifically, it says, the great prince who was in charge of your people. Remember, Daniel is a Jew. He's a Hebrew. And it seems to be suggesting that Michael has a specific responsibility to the people of Israel. And that the people are going to experience a time of trouble as such as never been seen since the nation till that time. The Hebrew people, the Jewish people, the people of Israel, the people who have experienced the Holocaust. And Daniel is looking, if you remember, and I apologize if you haven't been participating in this whole study, these last 5 or 6 weeks that we've been looking at Daniel 7 through 12, if you don't know about all of the stuff that's happened up to this point, but Daniel is praying about, he's seeking the restoration of Israel. He's saying, hey, we're coming up on this timeline, this Jeremiah prophecy of 70 years. And at the end of these 70 years, can we expect the restoration of Israel? God, have mercy on Israel. Bring restoration to us. And this is the word that God is giving Daniel. This is the apocalyptic prophetic word that there will come a time of trouble such as the nation has never seen, a nation that has experienced the destruction. I mean, they've already been exiled. The temple's already been destroyed. Daniel has that in his mind. And since that time, we have seen the second destruction of the temple in AD 70 by the Romans. We have seen the Jewish people persecuted, pogroms, the Holocaust. And this is most likely referencing a time that has not yet come. This is a prophetic word that is talking about the end of times, the end of the world, essentially. And that the Jews are going to suffer a greater way. These are hard words. This can't be what Daniel's hoping for. Let's continue. But at the time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book of life. Verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of earth shall awake. So that dust of earth, sleep in the dust of earth, is talking about resurrection. It's talking about people who have died and will come back to life. But again, Daniel is seeking the restoration of Israel. He would desire to see a physical kingdom, and the hope that's being brought forward in this interpretation of the vision is that restoration is going to come at the resurrection. Again, not words that he's hoping to hear. Many of those who sleep in the dust of earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. For those of you familiar with the New Testament, it seems like we have this kind of sheep and goats. Matthew 25 talks about how God will judge the sheep and the goats, the sheep who have done his will, the goats who have done things they thought were in his will, but weren't really in his name. This idea of the final judgment. Verse 3, and those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So this idea of knowledge increasing, I've heard a lot of people suggest, especially recently with the advent of the internet, that maybe this is the time. Maybe we live in a time where there's this incredible boom in information, in knowledge is maybe not the right, it doesn't seem like we're getting wiser from the information, but definitely we clearly have more. We have lots of it, and maybe this is the time. Many will run to and fro, and the knowledge shall increase. But there's also been other times in history, right, that we've had increases in knowledge where, the Romans used technology to expand their kingdom. They used roadways to see this increase in knowledge. And that was the first time where the philosophies of the Greeks really permeated most of the Western world. And then later we saw Gutenberg develop the printing press. And so different points in history, people have wondered, maybe this is the time. Is it? Could this be the time? Maybe. Verse 5, then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, 2 others stood, one on this bank of the stream and one on that bank of the stream. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, probably an angel, who was above the waters of the stream, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? That's the question we've all been asking for a long time. How long is it going to be? Should we be reading these visions? Should we be understanding these dreams that Daniel has been having and asking the question, can we ask the question, how long? How long shall it be to the end of these wonders? Here's the response. And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever, God, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. Now, there's a lot in that, and there's a lot debated in that expression. A time, times, and half a time. We've actually seen that expression before in Daniel. If you remember back in chapter 9, a time, times, and half a time. And Daniel 9 also talked about this 3.5 year period. Revelation talks about this in Revelation 11. And lots of people through history have understood this to mean a time, 1 year, times 2 years, and half a time, a half year, a 3.5 year period of time, 1,260 days. And that number seems to occur throughout history, but people argue about what that number represents. For a significant portion of church history, people wondered if that might be years. It was called the I can't say the word, historicist view. I'm struggling with that, but it was a view that was held by many Protestants, actually. And during the Reformation, and they would look back in time, and they would try to set up this time. They would say, well, this 1260 day number might be representative not of days but of years. And if we started around 759 AD, which was this significant time in the Pope and the Roman Church establishing like a power that the Protestants understood to be an unjust way of governing, that if they tied it back to that there's this time period that we could look forward to 1,260 years, which was 2016 by most calculations. And that's what Daniel's talking about. But that didn't really that didn't really pan out. And really smart people, Martin Luther, John Calvin, considered this as a possibility. Others say, no, it's 3.5 years. That they look back at that prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, and they say, oh, this is the 3.5 years. This is tied into the last, there's the 77s, and that the last 7 is going to happen at the end. And this is also talked about in Revelation, and that this is all tied into the tribulation. And this is a reference to that, which makes a lot of sense, and I understand why that's a popular theory. I'm going to tell you, this is part of the challenge for me. I've wrestled with this a lot, and I'd like to say, hey, clearly this is what it is. Cornerstone, this is what you can bank on. I can tell you that this is what is popular, but I'm also going to tell you what is said right after this when Daniel reads it. He says, I heard, but I did not understand. And Cornerstone, I'm just going to be honest, I'm right there with Daniel. I hear it, but I don't understand it. What's also said here is that at the end of this time, the time, the times, and the halftime, that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things will be finished. In other words, at the conclusion of all these things, when is this all going to take place? That's the question. And the answer is at the time of the shattering of the power of the holy people. Wow. Again, Daniel's hoping for the restoration of Israel, and he's being told, hey, all these things are going to come to be at the time of the shattering of your ultimate hope. Wow. It's hard words. I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, "Oh Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? If I can't understand the time frame of these things, what will be the outcome of these things?" And he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined." That's what we want to be, church. Cornerstone, that's what we want to do. Many will purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But those who are wise shall understand. I don't know about you, but I read it, I'm like, I still don't understand. I don't understand all this stuff from Daniel 7 to Daniel 12. It doesn't totally make sense. And my first thought is, am I supposed to understand all that stuff? No, I don't think so. I think the thing we're supposed to understand is that during the time where these things are shut up, our responsibility is to, verse 10, purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined. That's the wise thing to do, not to act wickedly. Verse 11, and from that time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination which makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days, very close to that 1260 number we just talked about. And there's lots of debate about why there's an extra 30 days. And I don't know that you can get on the internet about this stuff, but let me tell you this. You get on the internet, you're going to get down weird rabbit trails. It is a quick descent into bizarro land. And so there are debates, there's good scholarly material that's available on this, but these numbers, again, I'm right there with Daniel. I don't understand. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at 1,335 days, but go your way till the end, and you shall rest, and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. Daniel 12. So what do we do with all this? What is the purpose of Daniel 7 through 12, which is, many scholars suggest, is the first of what the Bible calls apocalyptic literature. Not the Bible. Many scholars call this section apocalyptic literature in the Bible, and they usually group into that the book of Revelation, 2 Thessalonians 2, Mark 13, a portion of Matthew 24. There's some other stuff that is pseudo-apocalyptic, but also prophetic. This is kind of a tight little knit group of literature that's called apocalyptic literature. What's the purpose? What's the reason for this? Some would suggest that the purpose is to give us a roadmap for the end times, to be predictive, to show us what is going to happen, what is going to take place, what's the time frame, how's it all going to go down. I met a man this week in my wanderings who was very aware of these scriptures, these apocalyptic scriptures, and he was in our conversation bouncing all over the place between Daniel and Revelation and tying it back and forth between the New Testament. And then he jumped back into like the old covenant with Israel and how the feasts were tied into the bowls and in Revelation. And he had a whole bunch of ideas about how this all worked together. And he was trying to predict a time. He was trying to come up with a timeline for when God would come back. And he actually suggested to me that the time was at hand, that most likely everything was going to go down next year at the Passover, because God does things in a predictable and reasonable way, and that next year at the Passover, we were going to see the end. And I don't share that story with you to shame him, but to suggest to you that I don't believe that apocalyptic writing was intended as a roadmap for the believer, for the Christian. Maybe there's some of that. Maybe there's some value somewhere in there, but I don't think that's its primary purpose. And that's a big maybe in my mind. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, nope, none of it is predictive in nature. It is prophetic. And I think for the most part that those who go through the end times will look at this And they will say, yep, Daniel talked about this. Yep, the book of Revelation talked about this. And now we can see it. In the same way that when Jesus died, was buried, and rose again, the disciples could look back and go, oh, now I get those prophecies in the book of Isaiah. Now I see the connections. I think that will be the primary purpose. But not predictive in the sense like we're supposed to read it as the survival handbook for Armageddon. See, because if I were going to write a book for my children on how to survive in a zombie apocalypse, I wouldn't be so vague. Like we have those words from Matthew 24 that say, when the abomination of desolation, when you see the abomination of desolation in the Holy of Holies, which is referencing back to these passages in Daniel, what you're supposed to do is flee to the mountains. That's like the only thing that it tells us what we're supposed to do. Really? That's it? Like I could use a little more information than that. I would appreciate maybe knowing where to go, how to get food. Maybe should I like work, brush up on my jujitsu skills? Do I need to stockpile weapons and food? I don't think it's supposed to be a roadmap. I don't think it's supposed to be a survival guide. So what is it supposed to be? Well, we talked about this in the very first sermon that we looked at on the book, the second half of Daniel, about the blinds. Remember this conversation where we talked about how apocalyptic literature helps us be able to see when we have slatted blinds like this that close and we can't see things. The world wants to do that. The world wants to tell us a story. It wants to say, this is how empires work. This is how dynasties work. This is the way the world is supposed to be. And that apocalyptic literature opens up those blinds and says, no. The way you're supposed to view this is totally different from what the world is presenting to you. The author Jamie Smith says, unfortunately, we often associate apocalyptic literature with end times literature as if the goal were a matter of prediction. But this misunderstanding of the biblical genre, because the point of apocalyptic literature is not prediction, but unmasking, unveiling the realities around us for what they really are. So I want to suggest to you that apocalyptic literature, that Daniel 7 through 12, more than being a roadmap, more than being predictive, more than being a survival guide, serves a different purpose. And that purpose is a lot like a love song. Now, I hope you went, huh? Wait, what? A love song. Love is a funny thing. Love is a hard thing to define. Have you ever tried to explain love? Like, I could give you the clinical explanation of love. I could give you an emotional explanation of love. I could say, hey, there's this word agape, and it's this Greek word, and it means this one kind of love, but there's also eros, which is like a physical attraction kind of love, a sexual love, and then there's I could do all that. But if I really want to express the idea or the concept of love, I would use a song. Because the song conveys an idea much more powerfully than an academic explanation of that idea. So, for example, Melissa and I at our wedding, once the service was concluded, and you may kiss your bride, we walked back up the aisle, and we walked up the aisle to Louis Armstrong's "Give Me a Kiss to Build a Dream On." It's a beautiful song. It's this idea about a person who is asking his lover to kiss him, and that the experience, the memory of that individual person, that one person, will give him the image to create a whole nother reality. Every year we do this, and we all have the songs that are meaningful to us. Every year, I compile a list of my favorite music, and I call it 2020, 2019, 2018. If I go back through those lists, I can find love songs that I'm the sentimental one in our family. I can find love songs that are associated with each year. One year it was Chris Stapleton's Millionaire. If you haven't heard it, go listen to it. It's a great song. It says this guy's driving around like a junky, beat up old car, which I identify with. And people are looking at him, and they look at him and they see the woman that he's riding next to, and they're like, they don't see the car anymore. They say, that guy is wealthy beyond reason. He's a millionaire. And I can go back 5 years and find a different love song from every single year that's significant or important in my life. And I think that apocalyptic literature does this very thing. It helps us see things differently. It helps, and I'm not going to suggest this is an exhaustive list, but I'm going to give you 3 things that apocalyptic literature helps us see, helps us interpret the world. And the first is this: apocalyptic literature gives us comfort that God is in control. Comfort that God is in control. And we see this because a lot of what's happened in Daniel 7 through 12 has already come to be. Like, remember the story in chapter 7 about the 4 beasts? And how all 4 of those beasts, we've seen those kingdoms come. And those kingdoms that Daniel was able to predict what was going, well, not Daniel. Daniel's vision from God showed us the kingdoms of Persia, the kingdoms of Greece, the kingdoms that followed. And again, in chapter 8, we saw that same kind of a thing, the story about the goat and the ram, and how those 2 factions warred with each other. We talked about Antiochus Epiphanes, who was this king that was coming out of the Seleucid kingdom, and it's all predicted in much of Daniel, and we've seen that play itself out across this. There is a place for God's comfort in our lives, that he is in control through this apocalyptic prophetic literature that we've seen play itself out already. But the second thing that apocalyptic literature does, and again, I'm not suggesting it's an exhaustive list, but the second thing it helps us see is this. It helps us cut through the sentimentality of Christianity, of people who misrepresent verses like Romans 8:28, where it says, God works all things together for good for those who love and fear him. And then don't jump onto the next verses in that passage and read it in context and just kind of throw it onto a card, Hallmark card, and say, hey, sorry about your loss, but God will work it all together for good. No, apocalyptic literature, we've seen it again and again, and we see it in chapter 12, where Daniel is wanting to see the restoration of Israel, and God is like, guess what? This is tough. This is hard. I will work, but I will work through suffering, and I will bring about glory. This is the story of our redemption through Christ. Christ redeems us through what? Through suffering and death on a cross. And we anybody who's lived on this planet for any period of time, we should get this. Life is not sentimental. It's not, we can't just leave our Christianity at this place where, well, everything's supposed to be good. Live your best life now. Because that's the message the world would want to tell us. The world would want to say to us, hey, you know what? You want to be successful? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And they would disregard some of that suffering stuff. But the apocalyptic literature opens the blinds. It says, wait a minute, these blinds are saying it one way. We got to open this thing up, and we got to say, guess what? Suffering is part of this. And God's redemptive plan is to work through the suffering. The final thing is that we aren't left alone in the place of suffering, but we move on to a place of hope. We aren't left just with the message of suffering. This is not just like a sedative. We don't just get this message of, in a sense, like embrace the suck. This embrace the terribleness of life. but we have the story of Jesus woven throughout these passages. Just turn with me really quick. If you just turn back in Daniel 7, it says this, Daniel 7:13, and I saw in the visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is everlasting, which shall not pass away. His kingdom, one that shall not be destroyed. We saw in chapter 11 that the Antichrist his kingdom would not last forever. That was the last verses of chapter 11. But this kingdom of the one who is to come, this is Jesus, will be a kingdom that is not destroyed. We have apocalyptic literature to give us a vision of hope. So those three things again, God has given us apocalyptic literature. And I want to draw this out a little bit further, because if apocalyptic literature was simply given as a roadmap for the end times, that means that Daniel 7 through 12 and all these other passages we talked about, Revelation, the entire book of Revelation, that really, if the primary purpose of that was to just be a roadmap to the end times, then its only benefit would be to the people who live in whatever last generation the end times occur. That would be the primary benefit. Like, we have 2,000 years of believers who have read those passages, have been encouraged by those passages, have been moved by those passages, and we're supposed to just understand that as a survival guide? I don't think so. I think it was there for comfort. I think it was there to encourage those who are experiencing suffering, to strip away the sentimentality. I think it was there to give us hope. God is in control. Suffering will move to glory, and our hope is in Jesus. He's in Christ alone. That is some of the purposes that I have wrestled with and struggled with and believe that we have Daniel 7 through 12 for. So let's tie this thing up. Why should I care, John? What should I do with all this information? What's my takeaway? Well, first is this. If you've been part of this study, or if you've read apocalyptic literature in the past, if you've picked up Daniel 7 through 12 and you've said, I just don't understand it, so I won't read it. I just won't embrace it. I just can't. I won't. I would suggest that's not an appropriate way of viewing the scriptures. Read it again. When you come to it in your reading plans, when you have this inclination, maybe I should pick up the book of Revelation. Maybe I should re-look at this passage that is confusing or frustrating or challenging. Read it again. Because I think that part of the purpose of this apocalyptic literature is important. I would suggest that. Secondly, I think if we've been at a place where we have kind of embraced the sentimentality of Christianity, and you'd have to wrestle with this yourself, but if you have tended to focus on the good parts of Christianity, it's time to reconsider that. It's time to push some of that to the side and to really wrestle with, what does it mean to be a Christian in a world that is fallen? What does it mean to live in a place of suffering? You know, I also think I'm gonna close with this. The last piece of this would be that we need to look for Jesus. And in chapter 12, we have a little hint at Jesus. If we just connect the dots a little bit, and that's that reference to the book of life. It says this, and there shall come a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation till this time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, and everyone whose name shall be found written in the book written in the book. What book? Well, we have a hint about that in Revelation. Flip over to Revelation chapter 5. Because this is truly the hope that we take away from these passages. And this is the place where I would leave you. This would be your takeaway, is to not find yourself in a place where you're fearful about these kinds of expressions or these kinds of stories, but to leave yourself in this place. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break the seals?" This is the book of life. And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth or was able to open the scroll or look into it. And I began to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll. And one of the elders said to me, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." Jesus is right there in Daniel 12. That is where we find our hope. I love you, Cornerstone. I miss you. It's good to stand in this space and look around and see a familiar area. But really, I'm missing each and every one of you this morning. Have a good morning. Be blessed. We'll talk to you soon.